Hey everybody, welcome to AP Macroeconomics. This is Mr. Farmer. Today we're talking about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So the aggregate demand is a schedule or curve that shows the amounts of real output that buyers collectively desire to purchase at each price level. So here we have the graph on the x-axis, the horizontal, we have the real output or real GDP, and that's going to be what we typically use as real GDP. On the y-axis, we have the price level, which again is pretty much the price index. So if you remember, the rules for inflation, consumer price index new minus old divided by old, the whole growth equation. Meaning if price level increases from P1 to P2, that would identify inflation, for an example. And so if the price level goes down, it would identify deflation based on that equation. So let's go back a little bit to identifying nominal versus real GDP. So real GDP is the nominal GDP divided by the price index in hundreds. Again, let's kind of rearrange that a little bit. So that means the nominal GDP is the real GDP times the price index in hundreds. So what's that mean? Well, if we look at this, if I multiply my price index, my price level, times my real GDP, then P2, Q2, that is the GDP. We just multiplied the real GDP by the price index. So this is the GDP at that price level. And this spot right here is the GDP at this price level. So the big takeaway is that the aggregate demand curve is GDP. So the expenditure approach, C plus I plus G plus net exports, is going to play a huge role in our conversation. Okay, a couple quick little notes. Aggregate demand curve, it has an inverse relationship between price level and real GDP, similar to how in microeconomics there's an inverse relationship between prices and quantities purchased. So it's downward sloping. Not for the exact same reasons as the micro. With that said, is there's a lot of overlap between these two. So for the macro, there's three effects: the real balance effect, interest rate effect, and the foreign purchase effect. If you remember, these are similar to first semester. We had the substitution effect and the income effect, meaning these three reasons are why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, and some of them are they just make sense. So real balance effect. If inflation is high, people buy less goods. That's pretty much it. If inflation decreases, people buy more. So as the GDP deflator, again, we're substituting GDP deflator for consumer price index, for GDP price index. They're just interchangeable for our purposes. So you can see is if the purchasing power decreased, people buy less stuff. They might buy a larger dollar value, but as far as the real output, they are going to buy less. Why? Their money doesn't go as far. And so the real balance is the adjusted for inflation, your bank account balance does more or does less based on inflation. Therefore, a higher price level reduces consumption. Again, important asks, how far will the money actually go? And we're holding things like national income stable. So the national income stays stable, inflation price goes up or down, we create this aggregate demand curve, this downward sloping section. Interest rate effect. We don't really do this one as much, but that said, it definitely highlights how we do talk about different things going forward. So let's think about the real balance effect. If the price level goes up, then in order to buy the same amount of goods, you're going to have to dip into your savings accounts, right? And we'll find in the banking sectors that saving accounts are the basic supply of money for loans. So think about that investment demand curve. So if real interest rates increases, people will borrow less money. That's based on this investment demand curve. So let's go back. If there's an increase in the price level, people dip into their savings accounts. So less money is available to the banks, so they're going to increase their interest rates. So what's that mean? If interest rates increase, people spend less money. So again, because it starts with the real balance effect as our starting position, we really don't use this in general. With that said, is this conversation between real interest rates and its impact on spending, that definitely gets talked about going forward. So you do want to remember that. And the last one is the an example for the interest rate effect. So I'll go pretty quickly through this one. So if you have, say, $10,000 and you buy 100 items with it, if the CPI changes from 100 to 50, your income goes from $10,000 to a real value of $20,000. So in order to buy the same 100 items, you need to spend now $5,000, not $10,000. So what do you do with the extra $5,000? You put it into a bank. Well, the bank now has more money. More money means they will charge less for their loans, so then more people will take out loans. And so people, if they take out more loans, have spent more money. So again, the real interest rate effect definitely goes both ways, even though we do talk about mostly from the point that the interest rates increase. So because the CPI decreased through a series of events, people buy more stuff based on this current scenario. So that's the interest rate effect. Again, the reason why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. Last one is the foreign purchase effect. So we think about like Pepsi and Coca-Cola, but instead of Pepsi, let's talk about Paraguay. Sure. And C, we'll talk about Canada, because Paraguay and Canada always trade apparently. Well, before, if the price of Paraguay's goods were $1, then people would import 50 units, and people from Canada, if it was the same price, would import this amount. Well, instead of prices, we'll say the price level, meaning inflation. If inflation increases in Paraguay to a 2, it's like a 200 or a 100% increase in inflation, and Canada stays the same, guess what? People are going to buy less from Paraguay. The foreign purchase essentially is the substitution effect on the international level. People are going to buy less of the more expensive one because of inflation, and they'll buy more of the one that has a comparatively lower inflation rate. Even though it didn't actually change compared to the alternative, it is less. So that's the foreign purchase effect, really similar again to the substitution effect from the micro conversation. So when U.S. price levels rise relative to foreign price levels, foreigners buy fewer U.S. goods and vice versa. So we see this happening, absolutely. Last, we're going to talk about determinants of the aggregate demand. So a change in one of these determinants is going to shift the aggregate demand curve. It will increase, decrease, shift left, shift right, just like the micro conversation from demand. So what are those determinants? We've already seen them. They're the expenditure approach. One thing before we get into that is we still need to remember the multiplier effect. Again, if there's a shift in the demand to some extent, it actually gets multiplied across. You get the ball rolling and it will keep going. So if you have an MPC of 0.75, this initial change in the aggregate demand is going to shift it 4 times over in nominal values. The graph can take into account inflation, so it is very helpful to use this. So, for instance, consumer spending. What would change consumer spending? Well, let's think about the wealth effect. If your wealth increases, consumer expectations, household debt, if you're willing to spend more, if you're willing to get more into debt. Okay, personal taxes, again, think about that investment demand curve, all those conversations. People are going to spend more or less, not because their income has changed, but because of some other reason. How about businesses? What will make them change theirs? Real interest rates. Again, if the real interest rates decrease, it costs you less money to borrow, so you might borrow more money. Or expected returns. How about conditions to just run your business? If that's about future business legislation conditions, technology, excess capacity, conversation from first semester, talking about monopoly competition, change to business taxes. All these are reasons why a company might increase and potentially decrease their investment spending. How about the government? That's going to be fiscal policies. We're going to talk about that later. Next, net exports. Well, this is part of that foreign purchase effect, talking about inflation rates, national incomes abroad, desirable products. Again, that's going to be more on the foreign exchange portion of our conversation, which will come later. So we mostly do the domestic stuff just to start with, but the net exports is definitely something to consider, and we'll come back to that when we talk about exchange rates and inflation later this semester. So again, if any one of these categories changes, the C, I, G, net exports, that changes the GDP. And as we said before, GDP is the aggregate demand curve. So the reality is, we've already done this. At this point, I'll have you do the 10.1 worksheet. Again, there's the aggregate expenditure model, which we don't really do much with. If you want, you can McConnell and Bruce 17th edition, read 192 to 196 for aggregate supply, to take notes on that. With that said, I'm going to quickly go over that next part. Aggregate supply. Supply curve showing the levels of real domestic output that firms will produce at each level. So you can see we have the short-run aggregate supply curve, AS or SRAS, and with the long-run aggregate supply curve, or LRAS. We talk about both. So long and short run. Long run, a period in which nominal wages and other resource prices match changes in the price level. Things like Social Security are being adjusted. Okay, the idea that the resource prices, electricity, wages, other utilities, in the long run, the resource prices adjust to the inflation. The person who provided that resource, they need to make ends meet, and so they're going to adjust to what they know is now a higher price. So what does this mean? In the long run, the economy is going to be at their full employment. They're going to be at their potential output. So that's going to be a pretty significant thing. In the short run, a period in which nominal wage and other resource prices are not adjusted is, well, the ability to produce is upward sloping. Why? Opportunity cost. If you want me to produce a lot more stuff, I have to pay my workers a lot more money. And so I have to increase the overall prices. And if this happens all over the place happening, I have to raise my price levels in general. So in the long run, again, it's the definition of full employment, is the NRU, the natural rate of unemployment. And NRU is our full employment. So this says if we have our fixed resources, the capital we have is just stable, this is how much stuff we should be able to produce. Why? Well, because that's how much our variable resources can produce at. In the long run, the wages match the price level, so the amount produced is going to be pretty darn stable with our fixed resources. But as you ask for us to do more stuff, I'm going to keep increasing my resource price. I'll increase the wages, I'll increase the price of electricity, etc., etc., etc. Aggregate supply, rise in price level increases the real output. Why? You pay me more, I'll produce more to an extent. Eventually, I'm not going to be able to keep producing, so it gets a little more vertical. Although when we draw it, we just kind of draws a straight, kind of a 45-degree angle. Realistically, is at some point we're at max capacity. We can't produce any more than that. It's kind of based on a thing called the classical theory of economics, which is still very much a conversation to be had here. So the per unit production cost, the total input cost, the units of output, all those things can change. The curve is relatively flat below full employment. Some refer to it as sticky wages and the Keynesian supply curve. Meaning the unemployed resources and unused capacity allows firms to respond to price levels in general. Okay, if there's a large increase, we're really far below our unemployment levels, if people need jobs, we need to start producing, I don't need to pay a lot more money to them. Eventually, when we get beyond full employment, those resources are not as readily available. And so in order to produce more, I need to charge a larger price. Companies cannot respond to the change in price levels. They just increase the price levels. And that's when we start to get to hyperinflation conversations. So you see this RDO, real domestic output, FE, would be full employment. So we're right here. So if you're really far below that, well, resources are readily available, and so the price levels don't change that much. If you're beyond that, you're kind of at your max capacity. Now again, this is more economic theory. For our class, for AP macroeconomics, you usually draw kind of a 45 upward sloping aggregate supply curve, just simplifying this, and it's really kind of cutting this section out right here. Aggregate supply curve can change. If input prices change, then you can produce more or less. Again, usually on the energy sector, because it has to be stuff that is happening all over the place. That could be imported resources. Okay. Really, overall, it's on productivity. If there's an increase or change in productivity, like increased capacity, technology that is new for everybody, it would shift your aggregate supply curve. Institutionalized environment, business taxes, subsidies. Again, if it's harder or easier, more relaxed tax systems, then you can produce more or less accordingly. And so again, here we have our aggregate supply curve. We'll just draw as an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, and then we have our aggregate demand curve downward sloping. We do focus mostly on the aggregate demand curve shifting, but But the aggregate supply curve can shift as well. Mostly think of if there's a change in the resources, does that change the ability to produce? Is it an increase or a decrease? All right, that's it for ASAD. Definitely more to this conversation, but that's just kind of a start. Until next time.